accept it. If you don't, we're going to do dreadful things to you and your bodies. So yes. And
This is,
go ahead.
Lisa, this is one of the compromises, though, with respect to the Pueblos after the so-called reconquest, I would say resettlement, in 1692 to 94.
Right.
One of the rules that was changed was that the priests could no longer force conversion upon the indigenous peoples. If they could talk them into it, fine, but they could not bother with the indigenous religious practices as they had previously. There were 3 or 4 compromises with the in the 1690s to 1720s that made the adjustment of the Spanish and the Pueblo peoples living alongside be much more peaceable than what it had been beforehand. And one of them was pulling the priest's authority to enforce conversion.
Thank you. I didn't know that. He probably taught it to me, but that was a few years ago. Okay, Ted and Eleanor, I told folks before you came that the place we're getting these questions are from Howard Zinn himself, out of that book that you and I bought.
Yeah. I had a couple things I really wanted to lift up from the 2 chapters.
Can you do chapter 3 first?
Huh?
Can you do chapter
first?
Yeah, chapter 3. What stood out to me in that one was this fact. Okay, that racism. I'm going to read, in fact, the paragraph.
Okay.
From that, because
what page
we got to realize that the U.S. and South Africa, for fairly different reasons, but yet not, developed this is not typical of most of the rest of the world. Even in Europe, there's not the racism that they have here.
What page
or South Africa. So anyway, his statement in here, racism was becoming more and more practical. Edmund Morgan, on the basis of his careful study of slavery in Virginia, sees racism not as natural to black-white difference, but something coming out of class scorn, a realistic device for control. If, quote, this is a quote, if free men with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon, that's from Bacon's revolt in 1676 we're talking about, that Bacon had done. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism. To separate dangerous free whites from dangerous black slaves by a screen of racial contempt. So here, this is what happened in this country. It was not natural, but they created a black-white dichotomy and they used the Bible to enforce it.
Misinterpreted and misread.
Misinterpreted, saying the curse of Ham when it wasn't, it was the curse of Canaan. I think we already talked about that. But they deliberately, it was a deliberate effort to keep them apart, to keep poor whites and blacks from joining together.
And apparently the Indians too, they caused, tried to get the Indians to hate the blacks and vice versa also.
Yeah, oh yeah, the Indians get in there, but thinking of the black-white problem we have in this country, this was a deliberate, contrived effort to, and unfortunately it's worked too well. Even though we haven't had slavery now for 150 years, we're stuck with it. Need to unmute. Jennifer, if you want to say something.
Jennifer, did you want to say something?
I thought Jennifer was wanting to pop in there, but we need to have you unmuted.
Okay, well, that was one of the questions that Howard Zinn put in his
Yeah,
thing. He said, starting, let's see, where'd it go? Starting with Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing the colonial government. There had also been 6 Black rebellions from South Carolina to New York and 40 riots of various other origins. By this time also emerged stable, coherent, effective, and acknowledged local and social elites. So that was the time of the upper class. And then by 1760, the local leadership saw the possibility of directing much of the rebellious energy against England. So his question was, did all this happen because of a conscious conspiracy or by an accumulation of tactical responses? And his answer is, it was not a conscious conspiracy, but all these little things added together.
yeah.
To add that.
And we
Anybody?
need a little correction on the Native American. The racial problem between Black and Native American was of a very minor nature. The Seminole, for instance, have a very high percentage of African blood from escaped slaves going down into Florida. Some Blacks we worked with in Georgia, helping to establish a local chapter of the NAACP, claimed a higher percentage of Cherokee blood than Black, though the community classified them as Black. And as recently as about 10 years ago, the Navajo queen was half Black, but she was raised by a grandmother on the reservation and could butcher sheep just as good as anybody else.
Very cool. Okay.
I have a question. We talk a lot about the slavery in the South, but there were slaves in the North too. To what extent was slavery practiced in the northern colonies? I don't know the answer, and he doesn't address it very well, I don't think.
No, he does. There was a higher population in New York than the others, but with the immigration coming in after the revolution, the percentage decreases substantially. What we are dealing with long term, and I think that will be in the next lecture, is Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. We have a system of slavery prior to that and an entirely different system in the South that has become a cotton economy. Even the way the Native Americans were shoved to the West differs between the North and the South, depending on whether or not it was an area where cotton could be grown.
Oh yeah, and it was more in the South. That makes sense. Do you have a date when the North?
1796 when it's patented.
Say again?
1796 was when the gin was patented, though it doesn't become a big industry until maybe 1810.
Okay, was there
We'll go in the future election.
was there a specific time when they declared that the North will have no slaves?
No, this was a gradual process. I don't know at what point I'm jumping ahead of myself. One 30s and 40s was Barton W. Stone, who was one of the founders of the Christian churches. So and the Quakers were strongly anti-slavery. One of a domestic, and that comes up the next lecture, of Martha Washington runs away to New Hampshire, and the locals there hide her so she cannot be brought back as a chattel to Martha Washington. We have a gradual shift in the North saying slavery is wrong. It didn't happen overnight, and Lincoln even ran for president on stopping the expansion of slavery rather than abolish. Already this anti-slavery attitude was beginning in the North before 1800.
So we're talking about before the revolution of the blacks in the North. Were there blacks who were free men as well as being used as being slaves?
The first person killed in the Boston Massacre was a free black.
But
Ah,
Yeah,
what would be the percentage? Were there more black slaves or were there black freemen, or do we have any idea?
there were a number of black free men in the North by the time of the Revolution. Percentage-wise,
froze. Okay, Lori, why don't you Google that and see if you can find an answer and tell us next time if there was a percentage, if you
What?
want.
Homework? What?
Sorry, I'm a teacher. Okay, I want us to do this before we go to chapter 4. And I'm not going to write it up.
generation.
Okay.
Thank you. I want you to look at this chart, and if you want, I have it all typed up that I can email people later. But I want us just to think of these because these are issues Howard Zinn wanted us to think of out of his chapter 3. So what was the period? Oh, here we have African slaves, in case you can't read it, and indentured servants. So what was the period of servitude for African slaves?
Well, it was a lifetime, wasn't it?
Life, forever, or till death. Okay, so what was the period of servitude for indentured servants?
10 years?
5 to 7 years.
5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
And did you guys read that some of the masters of these guys tried to make it longer?
Right.
And some of the servants went to the elite, who were the law, and they got beaten for asking for fairness. So they had a pretty rough for a while, okay? Now, I put these in the wrong order. So we have to go down here to conditions of their voyage. What were the conditions of the Africans' voyage to the United States?
It was horrible. No
Okay,
food, crowded.
it was so crowded we can't imagine.
Right.
They put them in coffin-sized spaces.
They got sick. There was no food or water.
Yeah, they could lose half the cargo.
Yes, they even died.
Just to death, yeah, to disease, because you can't live like that. They had no bathroom facilities. The stench, every time I've read about these, whoever's writing about it talks about the stench. Anybody else?
They were chained, restrained, not just restrained, but chained.
They were chained together at the neck. Can you imagine that around your neck and at the feet? They were probably chained everywhere. There was hunger. There was beatings. One thing that really jumped out at me is the obliteration that began in the voyage and ended up on the plantations, the obliteration of a culture that they were very community-minded, family-minded group of people, and their families, they were cut off from families and community. They spoke different languages. There's 1,000 or more languages on the continent of Africa. And they were tied up next to their enemies, but I bet they didn't stay enemies as long.
Well, and even prior to the journey, you know, they were in cages in the harbor for weeks. So it's almost like the breaking of the spirit started even before they were loaded on ships. And that was kind of like the point of, you know, this direct humiliation to break the spirit.
Absolutely.
But you know, you look at the here at the Pueblos, that's exactly what they tried to do with the young people, because they sent them to boarding school and they wouldn't let them speak their native tongues or do any of their religious or any of the ceremonial customs. And so, I mean, it was the same picture here. I mean, there in New Mexico.
Right. I know, we're so bad. The, oh, my brain thought of something. Okay, never mind. They were called ugly names. They were treated like dogs. Okay, let's move on to the conditions of the voyages for indentured servants.
In some ways, they were similar. There was no chaining, but ultimately, the conditions were so bad that, you know, there were even reports of the poor people who were transported practicing cannibalism during the journey.
Because they had run into storms or something and they hadn't brought enough food. Yeah. About that one. Anybody else?
A number of years ago, we were in Nova Scotia and we're inside the hull of the replica ship that brought the first Scots to Nova Scotia. And it was bunk beds, 3 high, narrow, and they had headwinds and lost almost 1/3 of the passengers on that trip. So it wasn't a nice journey. And these weren't even indentured servants. They were Scots seeking a new world.
Oh my gosh. Well, do you guys remember the German man that was on the voyage? And he wrote about the hunger, thirst, the filthy water, the shortage of food, people freezing or burning up, depending. And this one really got to me. The woman that was in labor and she couldn't deliver, and they pushed her out of a porthole. I couldn't believe that. That was just
That was horrid to read.
Yeah. And I didn't realize this. I thought all the indentured servants volunteered to go because they wanted better treatment. No. Sometimes they had forced exile because London and England was trying to get rid of all the poor people. They didn't want all these poor people wandering around. So for every little crime, they transported them to the Americas. So they were lied to, they were forced to go, they were kidnapped, and they were also put in a prison before sailing.
Yeah, debtor's prison.
Yes, and those places.
And that, you know, and they also sent them to Australia. So they were just, you know, anywhere they could get them.
Yeah, they really got rid of the poor people.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. The condition and their rights while they were slaves or servants.
They didn't have rights.
No rights.
They had to ask for permission to marry.
Yeah, the whites did, and the blacks, if they found out they were married, they just separated them. They just really kept up that breaking up of family and children all through the whole thing. So that was just awful. They were lied to, they were called ugly names. Now, what happened to the indentured servants to make them start hating the blacks so that they would quit? Because remember how they got together and had rebellions and whatnot? What did those elite rich people do to start separating these people? What did they do for the indentured servants?
Well, that's exactly what I was
Oh, was that your
talking
question?
about.
Right.
They developed it, they actually created racism
They did.
to keep these whites and blacks apart.
Does anybody know the details?
50 acres and a mule.
They got after a while, when the indentured servant shorter servitude was over, they gave them 50 acres. They gave them like 15 bushels of corn. They gave them 30 or 40 shillings. Then they gave the women some things. And I was flabbergasted by that. I didn't think anybody cared about the women at all. So, and the other thing that blew me away was when they needed, I think it was New York, Ted, I'm not sure, when they needed, they were getting more blacks than they had whites, and they needed people to patrol. They used whites, poor whites, gave them muskets and gave them some pay to keep the blacks in line.
Yeah.
Anybody
Well,
else?
I think that's actually an important point for today, because that's the beginning of militia in America, and that's why up to like today, literally, the perception of police in the Black community is that they're there to prosecute, and historically it has been so.
Yeah.
Any of you hear about Portland and the people protesting? My daughter lives in Portland and she lived a mile away from all this that was happening, and she worked in the building where it was happening. And the things that they heard were ridiculous, with our own president sending our own FBI to, and I don't know who all they sent. I couldn't stand to watch the news. They sent like soldiers.
Border Patrol.
Border Patrol to control Americans.
Yes.
That was scary. That's what really scared me about Portland.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, what were their forms of resistance? How did the indentured servants resist? How did the African people resist?
Very similar. Work slow, do a poor job, avoid discipline, hide out, the whole routine.
Run
Just
away.
like a kid in school that doesn't want to obey.
Running away. They both tried to run away.
Yes, they did. What I found interesting, some of the black house slaves slowly poisoned their white masters.
That's right. I know.
I mean, that blew me away. And suicides. They just got tired of it and just offed themselves, so they wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. Okay, last question for this chart. What were some methods that the elites used to control both the African slaves and the indentured servants?
There was punishment, but it differed significantly from, white race to black race, where indentured servants may have been whipped or, prescribed some other form of punishment. Basically, for African slaves, a lot of the times it was death or being sold somewhere else, families separated. And actually, I just couldn't help but make different contemporary connections when I was reading that. I was thinking about, the systemic racism today, like smoking marijuana. How many whites get away with that? I mean, a slap on the wrist or even nothing. We have white elite that smokes marijuana, and everything is paid off, and how many black men are in prison for that. even though research shows over and over that the percentage is very similar across, the racial lines.
That's a good point to bring up. How many more Black men and women are in prison than white people? It totally does not, it does not
Yeah.
match how many Black people there are and how many white people there are. Per capita, there is way more Black, Hispanic, people of color in prison than there are white people.
I think it's very telling that here they have a referendum, thing, and I can't remember what they call them. Anyway, on the ballot in November, and it's saying they can't make any menthol or mint flavored cigarettes or tobacco products. And there's a commercial by a Black woman who used to be a police officer. And they said that is very, very bad because those are the flavors that the Blacks and the Mexicans prefer, are the menthol cigarettes. And so that is just giving the police another reason to go into the Black community or the Hispanic community to get something on them, another touch point that they can use. And so she's saying, don't let it pass, So that, I thought that was interesting. So it's still happening.
Well, let me tell you, my mother smoked mentholated cigarettes. She died at 53. So that's a good reason not to do it, but to make it a law, no, that's not fair.
Well, they started codifying things. But it seems for the elites. The elites were, and the rulers, they put laws in place that leaned more toward them, but they were developing that middle class as a buffer between them and those on the lower end of the scale, the poor, the Blacks, the different other colors and everything like that. And by codifying things like this law that Nita talked about, and much harsher penalties for those than they would apply to the middle class or to the elites.
Thank you. That is a great segue to chapter 4. Tyranny is tyranny. So anybody else have something to say about the building of the middle class? It wasn't to help us. It was to keep the elites farther away from the poor people. Anybody else have comments on that? Do you remember where it happened?
It sounds to me like it wasn't always a matter of race. It sounds to me more like it was a matter of class.
Yes.
If you were an elite, you were an elite. And if you were not elite, you might be a slave, no matter whether you were American Indian, Black, or the indentured peoples,
Yeah, worked in the dress factories.
I'm sorry?
Working in the dress factories in New York, the clothing industry,
It doesn't matter. It seems like, though, that the split wasn't among whites and other races. It seems to me that it was among elites and the non-elites. And it didn't matter what their race was or what their background was or anything else. If they were not of the upper class, then they were subject to being a slave, the way it seems to me.
Does anybody
That's not untrue, but they did use racism to keep all the different groups of poor people from uniting. And so
Yes.
they really used that and set up structures to buffer them so that all the different groups wouldn't unite.
So in other words, they created racial problems
Exactly.
amongst the have-nots.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes. That's
They
the
did that because they were so afraid. That was the biggest fear of the elites, is that the lower classes would get together and overpower them. He
And
said,
that's what they're worried about right now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
That's exactly what they're worried about right now.
have
Well-
you read this and thought about today? And thought about what's going on today?
oh yes. We've got the tax cut, and who did it primarily? It was praised as a tax cut for the middle class, which it wasn't. But the elite are the ones that got the most advantage from it.
Uh-huh.
We've got Trump going in as the law and order president and stoking the conflicts because of his rhetoric. What we're seeing here is history repeating itself, and it's done that constantly.
That's what I think too. But we're not going to get into politics. What else? No. What else did you guys notice about Boston? What was happening in Boston that was like key to setting up the middle class?
Well, there was an enormous amount of smuggling through the port of Boston, not paying the British taxes. Fact is, the biggest smuggler was John Hancock.
Our founding fathers, huh?
But smuggling was common in the colonies. There's lots of small ports for ocean-going vessels, lots of timber with which to construct ships. In fact, one of the reasons Britain tried to hold on to the colonies was Britain itself was cut over, and they were using the northern colonies for the timber and the southern ones for the pine tar for their vessels. And the materials for shipbuilding were enormously available in the New World. The colonists were making, and it's becoming middle class, were making a go of it, and they were operating over, under, and around the law whenever possible.
Okay, the thing that I noticed was those people in Boston, you know, and it just sounded like Bostonians to me, whom I love. This is not a criticism. But they started going to town meetings, and they started voicing their concerns. And one guy, I can't find it in my notes, one guy of the elite wrote, "There's so many of these people coming that we keep getting outvoted." And they were so incensed. And I thought, go townies, go townies. So anything else in Boston? They were the key, what do you call it? What Ted just said.
Demographic?
Of what?
Demographic?
No, it's what Ted just said, and the word went in my brain. Were they smuggling?
Yes, smuggling. But it happened all up and down the coast. It's just that we have a new middle class and lower level wealth developing in the Boston area because of smuggling.
We have that was happening then, right? Is that what
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, what did the British do to monopolize all the trade and take it away from the Dutch and that other big group?
They initiated another law that said you can only sell to Britain.
Yes.
No foreign ships can come in. You know, only British ships. So again, you have the elite in England, which trumped the elite here, making it so that people couldn't get ahead and take away the wealth that England wanted from the colonies.
And okay, so let's go. We only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to finish this. Let's go to the Revolutionary War. What did the elites do to make the colonists believe that rebelling against England was the best thing ever?
Well, one thing they were doing is they were trying to get the heat off themselves.
Exactly. That's exactly what they were doing. So,
And,
anybody else have a comment?
But you must realize a lot of the elites, either like Benjamin Franklin's son, went back to England, they didn't stay, or they went to Nova Scotia or Ontario, where Great Britain was offering the Loyalists land. There was a big exodus of the Loyalists from the country, and this represented a lot of the elite.
Not enough. Okay, they were trying. Oh, go ahead.
I had a ancestor who came over as a mercenary during the Revolutionary War, and when he was ready, when it was time for him to go back to England, he had smallpox, so they wouldn't let him on the ship. So the U.S. government gave him some land and said, "Welcome to America." And so instead of prosecuting him for being a whatever enemy, they made him a citizen. So
That's interesting.
Very common.
Yeah.
That was common.
The band director of the British band at Yorktown that led them playing The World Turned Upside Down when they surrendered in Yorktown happens to be a direct ancestor.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I love that.
Weren't there a lot of German mercenaries fighting with the British? And
And
that's
they
how we
went
got
to Pennsylvania.
a huge.
Well, you know what? So many of them were just not the eldest son, because the eldest son inherited everything. So if they didn't have a trade or something, there was no way for them to make a living. So being a mercenary was a wonderful thing for them, you know. I mean, it was better than nothing anyway.
Or some of Eleanor's family went to Ontario and didn't come back to the United States until after the Civil War.
Yeah, my mom's mother was in the group that came back to the U.S.
Yes.
She was born in 1885, and they came back after she was born to the U.S. from Canada, but they had been Tories. They had left the country because they were royalists.
There you go.
Kind of going back to the book, there was a very tight control over the groups that exhibited rebellion. There were a lot of talented leaders like Patrick Henry who were actually from the elite themselves, but because they had the gift of speaking the language of the populace, the language of the persons of mean and position, that was understood by everyone. They were able to mobilize that energy of rebellion and kind of like refocus it into fighting against Britain. And again, I just couldn't help but make a connection with the riots. This whole spiel about let's not have violence erupt, that they were like really trying to control the anger of the people, which ultimately was directed against the elite, because what the rebellion did was actually like go and free others who were arrested, or go destroy those mansions of the people in power. But it's sort of like, it's like, no, peaceful protest. And I'm not going to go into the Gandhi philosophy of that, which is great, but still, it's sort of like, it's again like kind of putting the lid on this rightful and righteous anger of the classes that were kept suppressed.
I thought it was interesting. There was one note of, I think it was the Regulators or some group like that were leading a protest. And it was well organized in the beginning. And then when the leaders disbanded, the people that were left looted the house and burned it down, just similar to what's happening today.
Yes.
Absolutely. This is scary how much it's mirroring today to me,
Yeah.
or how much we're mirroring them, I guess we should say. It's kind of frightening.
Yes.
Because I
Yeah,
don't,
that brings up the point from this fourth chapter that I wanted to pick up, is that we have a forecast in all of this and the way things were handled of the long history of American politics. Like this I'm quoting here. The mobilization of lower class energy by upper class politicians for their own purposes. This was not purely deception. It involved in part a genuine recognition of lower class grievances. Not always, though. I think that that's what we're dealing with now, is it's not really a recognition of lower class grievances. It's a being using it as a pretext for to help themselves.
yes.
So it helps to account for it. It's an effective tactic over many centuries. You know, that the upper classes will mobilize the lower classes however they can to make their own, for whatever it is they want.
And who are our politicians but rich people, mostly? Not so much.
Yeah.
When
Yeah,
Dick
the
Bob
elite.
got in, I jumped up and down. I was so excited. But if you look at it, the majority is still rich people. Do you guys remember Michael Moore?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know who Michael Moore is.
Do you remember I don't know if you guys saw this movie. It was during the Iraqi thing under the son, Bush.
George W.
George W. And they were showing pictures. Michael Moore went up to a legislator, one of the senators or whatnot, and said, "Oh, are you going to send your son to this war?" And the guy was really friendly up until he asked that. And then I found out later one or two of the people that are ruling over us let their sons go to war in Iran. Then the other picture that I can't get out of my mind is a man, a military man dressed up in his dress uniform going to, it was in Detroit where things were so bad, going up to black kids and trying to recruit them into the war in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. I will never forget that picture. It just made me nauseous. And when I was reading this, it came to me. So, okay, last question. I could go on forever, but I want to go eat lunch. The last question, what did you think of Howard Zinn's tongue-in-cheek about what he perceived as the real causes for the revolution? What did you guys think of that? Do you remember it?
Yeah, the myth of the revolution.
The myth of this, we didn't get united, we just saved the rich people. So is there any more commenting about tyranny? Is tyranny, let me read the last line. Blah, 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 blah. The rich, of course, could pay a poor man to go fight for him in the revolution, but the poor had to serve. And this led to rioting and shouting, and they were shouting, "Tyranny is tyranny, whoever it comes from." They said it fancy, but that's what they meant. Tyranny is tyranny, whoever it may come from. So they recognized that. There were people there that recognized it.
Yeah. It didn't matter whether it was England or the elites in America, it was still tyranny.
Yes.
Well, we're still seeing the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. I don't see that it's changed all that.
No, I agree.
Well, and the language, that is like the language of the Declaration of Independence, which is pretty much considered to be sacred in the United States. I mean, you can't question it, but ultimately, it's manipulation. I mean, it's fanciful language, but even thinking about, what he says about Benjamin Franklin being the owner of slaves, I mean, how hypocritical he wanted to include that clause, right? Denouncing slavery, but at the advice of the elite or, pressure from the elite, it was struck down. But even forget about that. I mean, he did not part with his slaves until, pretty much, until he died. I mean, he did not denounce slavery on the personal level.
And he had a lot of, this with Thomas Jefferson too, had a
Yeah,
lot,
that's what I was gonna add.
had a lot of children from Black women.
Yeah, well, and I just,
Well, Sarah Henning, yep.
yeah, I feel it's, we always talk about the founding fathers, and, you pretty much like can't, touch the sanctity, of the founding fathers, but, right. But it's, I think it's time to question all of that. All men were created equal, like when, so many groups were blatantly excluded from that equality. It was ultimately, first of all about white men, and then only white rich men, of the time period. That's it.
Yeah.
Women were excluded.
All white men, landholders were created equal.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
About 10 years ago, the Genealogical Society of the descendants of Jefferson welcomed in all their Black cousins. So things can change.
It seems that the words of both what's on the Statue of Liberty and the Declaration of Independence are still ideals, which we aren't even close to coming close to at this point.
It was general enough that we can look at it as an ideal, even if it wasn't meant that way at the time.
Exactly.
You guys remember my question at the end of last week? And I wanted to ask it even more this week. What can we do to change this, let's go back to the old America, where all the white rule? No thanks. And where the government took Black men and gave them syphilis and watched them die and wrote about it. And where they took retarded people and scrambled their brains, what do you call them, lobotomies? Yeah, let's go back to that. I don't think so. So what can we do today as ourselves or as with our friends or whatever to stop this slide back in to what was happening there?
Vote.
Fight corporate greed. Yeah, that's what Katie just posted.
Vote.
And vote.
Yes.
For heaven's sake, they're saying this election is rare, maybe the most important election we've ever had
In our time.
in our time.
Well, out here, we have lots of sports teams, and they're, I mean, we have, we probably have 10 within 100 miles of me, and they're banding together to say, if you want your sports, you're going to listen to us, and we're not going to play unless you listen to us and help us get our message out. So,
but even with that, I was just reading an article about it today, and so the owners of Magic, right, which was one of the teams that refused to play, they're the DeVos family, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, whose dream it is to, redirect all of the public money from public schools into the private sector. So they jumped on the bandwagon, and they support the movement. They openly, are there amongst the supporters, but. This is just a play. They're playing a clever game, manipulating.
I think they know that if those players don't play, they don't have sports teams. So it's self-preservation. you know, of those people. But like the ones in LA, the Clippers, I think it is, they're turning, well, and the LA, anyway, the ones in LA, they're
Lakers.
turning the sports stadiums into voting places.
Whoa.
Yeah,
So,
that's becoming a nationwide.
yeah,
The NBA
okay.
is doing this.
yeah, the
Thank God.
Lakers. Yeah,
Okay,
the
so,
Lakers and the Clippers.
so, can you all think of anything else? I know you said the most important thing to vote, but would you keep thinking? Would you just keep thinking of, do you know any people that are on the line that you could have a genuine talk with? And you know what I'm doing? You know, I'm praying. I don't think I've ever prayed for a election like I am praying for this. So
Okay.
those that are prayers, let's join it. You know what? We probably should go. I am so happy you guys came. Does anybody know who was it that didn't come back? I was so sad. The O'Rourke's. Does anybody know them well enough to call them?
I'll see them on Tuesday and Thursday at the Coffee with the Pastor.
Okay,
Yeah.
would you tell me you just missed them and
Yeah,
we so enjoyed having them the first time. Just
yeah,
whatever.
I will tell them.
Okay.
I will tell them.
Anybody else that didn't show up?
Yeah, we'll get them back.
I think everybody else showed up, and then we got Jennifer and Ann. We welcome you too, Ann.
Yes.
Okay,
Are
God
we
bless
doing
you
the
guys.
next
And
Are we doing the next 2 chapters for next time? Is
Yes.
it okay?
We're doing
I'll check.
chapters every single time, so we only take 12 weeks instead of 24.
I think it'd be 13, but anyway, there's
Oh,
25 chapters.
Okay,
Oh,
God bless you all.
yes.
See ya.
See you all.
All right. Good to see everyone.
Yeah.